have sort of the first 5 minutes of entrances in the virtual Zoom room. So I'm very happy to welcome everybody to our workshop in cultural affairs. And we have two speakers today, and two whom I guess I've known for quite a little while now. We were just talking about the last time we saw each other, which was in the before times at a conference here at IU. But we have Mirae Kim from George Mason University and her co-author and collaborator, Alisa Moldavanova from Wayne State University. So very happy to have both of you here. And at this point, I will just turn it over to you, and I will monitor any questions in the chat or hands that come up. And you can just feel free to discuss your topic and not have to do any of that. So go ahead, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for nice introduction. And hello, everyone. It's very good to see many familiar names on this Zoom call. And thank you so much for inviting us to this cultural affair workshop. So our overall topic is cultural nonprofit, organizational connectedness, and pandemic caused crisis. So in our presentation, we have two parts. The first part provides some background research that talk about the pandemic caused crisis for particularly art and cultural nonprofit organizations. And I will explain later why we provide this background before jumping into the specific study that entitled The Helping Hand, does greater organizational connectedness lead to more resilient nonprofit organization, which I co-authored with Alisa here. So the first part of the study comes from a study that I led with my colleague at American University and Urban Institute. So the reason I wanted to share some findings in this study is that it uses a representative sample of 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides services directly to community people on an everyday basis. So this sample does not include an organization like community foundations or United Way. And also this sample does not include universities and hospitals. But there were some key interesting findings that were highly relevant for arch organization, because about 600 responses of this representative sample come from arch organization. And because it excludes universities and hospitals, the arch organization is the one of the largest group represented in this sample. And this national survey covers various questions, but the most important, like the relevant part of today's presentation include the questions that focused on the changes in revenue, other resources, programs, and financial stability during the 2020 pandemic. So I will highlight some of the findings coming from these questions, and just also wanted to share that our data coming from this project are available for public use. So if you are interested in looking at this study, that I can later share the link to the study and the data set in the chat. And it was also introduced in the Arts Research Currently that is part of the National Archive of Data on Art and Culture. And Bonnie on this call, I actually shared the link with me, so I was happy to also share the page with everyone on this call. So just to point a few relevant findings for this group, that this data have provided a clear empirical evidence that arch organizations were hit hardest, among other types, by declines in fees for service revenue, that you can see that they were really hit a lot harder than other subsectors. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to present just the impact of 2020 on arch organizations as compared to human service organization. So the blue bar represents the percentage of arch organizations that had to reduce the number of programs or services by organization size. And as we can see here, across various size, arch organizations had a much greater impact, and especially the smaller organizations had a lot greater negative impact on their programs. The same is true for the percentage of organizations that had to suspend or pause services. And again, smaller arts organizations had hit much harder. And these smaller arts organizations are actually the majority group in the arts sector, as you would already know. We also say that the percentage of organizations that reduced the number of people served was larger for arts organizations as compared to human service organizations across various sizes. And the last area looked at is the percentage of organizations that reduced the geographic areas they serve. And although the overall percentage for this impact is smaller than other issues, the data clearly signal that arts organizations were hit much harder in terms of their programs and finance. So the pandemic has reminded us that we need more understanding of organizational resilience, especially during unexpected crisis. So that brings us to the main study of today's presentation. And I will turn it over to my co-author, Alisa, to provide some background, the research framework to discuss the hypothesis.
Thank you very much, Mirae, and everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So the study that we are currently developing and will be presenting to you today actually includes both human service organizations and arts organizations. And we will talk today about some of the differences in the findings that we have to date, as well as how a variety of factors affect these organizations. So the reason why we planned this study is because, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is still ongoing, and so far we can see how different organizations are coping with this pandemic, which unpacks this question of organizational resiliency. So organizational resiliency is a key concept in this study, and we define it basically as the ability of organizations to withstand external stress. We're following a scholarship developed by other colleagues in environmental policy, safety, health, and some other policy areas to essentially argue that while the study of organizational resiliency is expanding and quite strong in a lot of these areas, unfortunately, when it comes to, you know, nonprofit management, there is not so many, or there's very few studies specifically trying to unpack the concept of organizational resiliency, as well as investigate empirically the predictors of organizational resiliency. So one definition that we adopt here follows the seminal work by Aaron Wildavsky that defines organizational resiliency as the capacity to cope with unanticipated dangers that have become, after they have become manifest, learning to bounce back. So the COVID-19 pandemic is an example of that type of stress. So, you know, while many organizations already experienced financial stress and other forms of stress, what the COVID pandemic has brought was in many cases completely unanticipated. And it was also the kind of stress where organizations didn't have much choice, meaning that they had to adapt, right? There was no way around. So it's a unique context that lends itself to the study of organizational resiliency. And it's also important for us to understand the resiliency of organizations, because arts organizations, much like some other nonprofit organizations, are critical contributors to community sustainability and sustainable development. But for those organizations to be effective in contributing and advancing community sustainability goals, they need to be resilient themselves. So that's where this paper is coming from. And the key contribution is adding the context of arts and culture as well as human nonprofits to the study of organizational resiliency. So let me now discuss the theoretical framework and approach that we have here after I introduce the two research questions. So in this specific paper, we are interested in how two factors influence organizational resiliency as the ability of organizations to withstand the pandemic-induced stress. The first of these factors is social connectedness, and the second of these factors is the resource base. So we're looking at how pre-existing social connectedness as well as how pre-existing configuration of organizational resources influence the ability of organizations to withstand the pandemic-induced stress. So to start us with, The social connectedness piece is largely based on a very substantial body of literature on social capital. So most of the works on social capital were developed in relation to individuals, arguing that social capital is important among individuals, and it presents a critical resource that help individuals advance themselves in a variety of ways. And this body of literature also applies to community context as well, essentially arguing that communities in general that have higher levels of social capital would also have higher levels of resiliency. And although there are various forms of social capital and different forms of social capital have different influence on community resilience, in general, the individual or community-based social capital is considered a positive force for supporting community resilience. There is a variety of ways to conceptualize social capital. In this paper, we are going with Putnam's conceptualization to include both networks and norms of trust as key elements of social capital that helps to foster cooperation and improves collective problem solving. Now, what we do in this paper, we transition from community and individual level of social capital to organizational social capital. And we use the term organizational social connectedness to describe social capital that exists among organizations. But the concept of organizational social capital was actually coined by John Schneider in her work on human service organizations. So you can see a couple of citations here. And then some other scholars, including myself, have followed up on this idea to develop it further and essentially argue that social capital exists at the community individual level, but also among organizations. So the distinction of social capital among organizations is that it's a durable and cumulative kind of social capital that's based on organizational history and reputation, and that tends to stay with organizations and be quite resilient, even though the CEOs may lead the organizations, program managers may change, and board members may change. So the organizational social capital is something that stays with organizations. And the theoretical argument here that in principle, much like individual or community-based social capital, in organizational social capital will likewise help organizations to obtain access to critical resources, and otherwise will help them to bounce back and remain resilient in the face of external shocks. The two specific types of social capital that we're using in this paper, once again, follow work by Robert Putnam, who distinguished between bonding and bridging social capital. So the difference between the two is that bonding social capital is formed among similar actors, and bridging social capital is formed among dissimilar actors. So in a non-profit context, the most straightforward example of bonding ties will be ties that non-profits form with other non-profits. And the most straightforward example of bridging ties will be the ties that non-profit organizations form with governments or form with businesses. So the typical forms of social capital or how it manifests itself include information exchange, resource sharing, and project-based partnerships, which are all expected to improve organizational resiliency. So aside from social capital, the second portion of the argument is that it's the pre-existing resource configuration that likewise will matter for the ability of organizations to withstand external stress. So here we are really following the resource dependency perspective that basically tells us that ability of organizations to navigate their external environments and effectively derive resources from their external environment is key to organizational survival, and by extension, it will be key to the ability of organizations to withstand and cope with stress. So we are specifically in this paper looking at the pre-existing level of organizational resources and resource configurations. So this is based on, the financial sustainability and resilience literature that is quite extensive in the nonprofit field. And we are looking at the overall budget as the proxy for access to funds. And we're also looking at funding diversity as one of the mostly recognized factors of nonprofit financial sustainability. So the argument here is once again is that the pre-existing resource base as well as resource configurations will be associated with the ability of organizations to withstand stress. So in this paper, we are testing 4 hypotheses. The first 2 argue that both bonding and bridging social capital will be associated with fewer negative impacts of stress on organizations. In other words, higher ability to withstand stress. And likewise, hypotheses 3 and 4 argue that more diverse funding as well as larger organizational budget would be associated with fewer negative impacts of stress on organizations. So the better ability to withstand stress.
Thanks, Alisa. And I will further explain how we tested these hypotheses to answer our research questions. So to do so, we used the data drawn from the nonprofit organization research panel project, which manages a set of cultural nonprofit and human service nonprofit organization across the country, as you can see in the map here, to run periodic online surveys. So these panel organizations are spread out across the country, and they are art and culture organization, human service. But because of its online nature and online opt-in panel nature, and there's a panel attrition, that it has limited representativeness to fully generalize the result, which was partly why that we started the presentation with some other background that uses the representative sample. So we took advantage of the panel nature of this project and used the 2 surveys that were conducted in 2 different times. So the 2017 survey focused on organizational collaboration and partnership, and 2020 survey focused on the impact of the COVID. So, and then we found that of these 2 surveys that 166 organizations responded to both surveys, giving us the opportunity to do longitudinal analysis. So we merged this survey data with the most recent 990 record coming from the National Charitable Statistics, the Charitable Statistics, and we merged the data for corresponding 166 organizations. But there were some missing values in selected variables for our analysis. So the final sample for this study has 150 observations. So just to reiterate, our dependent variable that looks at the impact of pandemic stress were measured in 2020, and pre-existing social connectedness come from the survey done in 2017, and pre-existing resource configuration come from 2018 990 records, and we control the organizational factors. The dependent variable, which is the extent to which an organization was subject to pandemic stress, the 2020 survey asked 17 kinds of impact an organization had, and we recorded 1 for those that said they experienced or anticipated experiencing, and otherwise 0. And for this particular analysis, we used 12 items out of 17 items because the remaining 5 items actually indicated a positive impact. So we only used the 12 items that suggested negative impact organizations were subject to. The overall impact is 1 dependent variable that we use, that is the measure that we combine the 12 dichotomous measures. So on average, arch organizations faced about 7 issues, which was not significantly more than the number of issues the human service organization had faced. And I will explain more in the later slides. And then for the independent variables, the social connectedness measure that come from 2017 survey asked organizations the number of partners for each type of partners, nonprofit, government, and for-profit partners. But because there were various, the outstanding values that secure the average value, we focus on whether an organization had or did not have each type of partners rather than using the raw value of the number of each partners. So partnering with the government and partnering with the business were identified as having built bridging social capital since 2017. And we operationalized bonding social capital in terms of having partnered with other nonprofits. And our the main independent variable capture the pre-existing resource base by the size of annual spending the budget and financial equity ratio and revenue concentration measure, which is a converse measure of revenue diversification. And for the sake of time, I won't go into the detail of control variables, but we can come back to this if you're interested. And they capture an organization's financial condition during the pandemic and other organizations' basic characteristics. So the first part of the analysis is the ORS regression result, where the dependent variable is the summative index of 12 items that I introduced earlier. So the result shows that organizations that built bonding social capital with other nonprofits were likely to have faced more challenges during the pandemic. And it also shows the negative relationship between bridging social capital and the number of challenges, meaning that those having more bridging social capital with other, the for-profit and government were likely to face fewer challenges, but the coefficients were not statistically significant. For pre-existing resource variables, we found that organizations with a larger annual spending and those with a more concentrated revenue structure are likely to face fewer challenges. And we actually looked at the result using the portion of contribution rather than just revenue diversification measure. And we didn't include both in the same model because of the multicollinearity, but if we just look at the portion of contribution revenue rather than the revenue diversification measure, that we also found that the organizations that rely more on donations were likely to face fewer challenges, which I found very interesting. And for this over negative impact, that we didn't find statistically significant difference between arch organizations and human service organizations, but we found some differences in the later analysis that I'm going to introduce shortly. So because we didn't find, we wanted to look at if there were difference in terms of the arch organization facing more or less difficulty as compared to human service organization. So we looked at disaggregate the separate challenges that individual organizations faced. So these individual issues that were coded as dichotomous variable, like 1 if they had or 0 if not. So we used the logistic regression model for these separate cases. And as you can see in the result, that arch organizations were more likely to change the way programs were offered as compared to human service. And and there are other issues that we see in the next slide and the following one. But arch organizations were more likely to also suspend the programs as compared to human service organization. And for the main research question, we found similar results to the over impact result that were introduced earlier, that organizations with a more bonding social capital were more likely to cancel events and change the way programs were offered. And organizations that built bridging social capital with the government were less likely to have had to change the way their programs were offered during the pandemic. And organizations that built bridging social capital with the government were also less likely to have declines in volunteers, but organizations that have built bonding social capital with other nonprofits were more likely to have had decreased donations. So in general, they had more issues to deal with. And in this, in these three issues, that virtual organizations were less likely to follow or lay off of staff members as compared to human service. And we thought this is a very interesting finding, but that deserve a little bit more investigation why they had they were less likely to lay off of their staff members as compared to human services. And in this, in these three other issues that we found that arch organizations having less issues with getting supplies, but that's just probably because they were more likely to stop the services altogether and didn't need supplies to begin with. And for the main hypothesis, we found that organizations that have built bridging social capital with the government were less likely to have canceled their contract, and those bridging with the business were more likely to have private donors pooling their funding. So overall, we find nonprofits creating more bonding type social capital with other nonprofits had faced more challenges. And we believe that's probably because these organizations are together, that they were likely to have, although they were likely to have a higher trust and more understanding with one another, during the crisis, they come with a resource redundancy, meaning that these organizations were likely to experience our similar pressures, and they were not in the position to help one another. They are similarly deprived of resources that make it just impossible for them to partner with one another, so everybody gets into trouble together. And even though the statistical results were somewhat weak or not existing for some of the challenges, our overall results suggest that it would be very important for these organizations to cultivate a bridging social capital that can help them access to more diversified information or diverse resource and network that organization within the same network cannot really produce or obtain. We believe that our study that uses a longitudinal data provides very variable empirical evidence that shows the clear picture for the relationship between the organization of pre-existing social connectedness and pre-existing resource with their resilience during crisis like pandemic. But we admit there are several limitations in this study. So first and foremost, that our analysis assumes that the social capital were built through the partnership in 2017, and those social capital built during that time through the partnership would have continued in 2020. But there is there can be a counter argument to what extent those social capital would have continued. And also mentioned briefly before, this study uses a sample that is not purely representative, and because we try to merge the survey data that come from two different times, the survey sample, the sample of the study is relatively small. So it would be worth to have a future study that expand the size of the sample and representativeness to further explore the relationship between the social connectedness and the resilience during the pandemic. Okay, so I think that's all for now, and we welcome your feedback and questions.
Great, thank you, Mirae and Alisa. And please, everyone, feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourselves. But I will go ahead and start off with the first one just to get it going. But I wonder if, do you know a little bit more about the types of partnerships that these organizations were involved in? So really kind of, I'm wondering, you know, I know the difference, how you're defining it between bridging and bonding, but like whether you had a chance to talk to any of these representatives and organizations to understand the types of collaborations that they were involved in, and maybe the effects of those collaborations on resilience just from their own words or interviews, if you've had a chance to do that.
That's a very nice question, and my short answer is no. I did not get a chance to hear more in detail explanation about how their collaboration or partnership helped during the resiliency, and that's actually a great suggestion for. I mean, this is still a working paper for us, and given that that the sample size for this particular analysis is about 150. I think it's doable for us to reach out to this organization again to ask about how their pre-existing partnership helped them to navigate the challenges during the pandemic period.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, just to think about the small sample size and being able to follow up. Because I start to think about things like ticketing collaborations or fundraising collaborations, but all of the different collaborations and what was really the sort of maybe the helped with efficiency measures or helped in these various ways that I would not know, but I would love to actually hear from the organizations themselves.
One thing I would like to add is just based on my previous research on arts and culture partnerships post-Great Recession, is that there appear to be three most common collaboration types and relationships through which at least arts and culture engage. The first one is communication or information exchange, and this could be about grants, other types of opportunities. So it's kind of regular communication type of partnership. The second one is resource share, which typically includes staff sharing and office sharing, which allows to save resources. And finally, project-based collaboration, which can be going after grants together or just collaborating on projects.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you, Alisa. I'm going to go to the questions. I saw Michael had his hand up first, so I'll call on Michael.
Okay, thanks very much, Mirae and Alisa. I really enjoyed that. I have two questions, if you'll permit that. My first question is about how you define the term resiliency. Because in your initial definition from Waldowski, resiliency defines, well, an organization that can handle making adjustments and sort of roll with changes. So if I were thinking about a household, for example, a resilient household would be one that, faced with a negative income shock, say somebody loses their job, they are able to survive by cutting back on different sorts of expenditures, making economies, but getting through what would otherwise be a rough patch. And I would think the same is true of organizations. And so in your empirical analysis, when you come to define resiliency, you list things like, cutting back on programming and so on, that actually don't seem to me like a lack of resiliency, but rather appear to me to be just sort of a very sensible response to a very large negative demand shock, saying, okay, we'll adjust this and that to get us through this patch so that we can survive as an organization until the next bit. So when I first saw the title of the paper, I thought resiliency was going to be survival. And here locally, we've had some businesses go under during the pandemic, and I would say, well, they were not resilient. They had to close, never to reopen. And so have you thought about that, like what resiliency actually means? Because making adjustments in programming, that seems to me you could be a very resilient organization. So that's my first question, is what are we actually trying to measure here?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, I can go first. Thanks.
So there is multiple ways to sort of measure resiliency. You're exactly right? So we basically use the language in the survey that Mirae ran right after the onset of the pandemic, which is one way to try to measure that concept. In my previous research, I went with the measure that you're talking about, so organizational closure, or severe impacts on the organization, and it's another way to think about the same concept. But what we did in this study, we basically are looking at the immediate impacts of stress on the organization that force some of these organizations to downsize and basically engage in cutback management types of strategies. And in the survey itself, and Mirae can talk more about that, she had both positive and negative impacts. So we chose the negative ones because they're an indication that organizations, had to downscale a bit which means that, you know, they might have not been as resilient in the first place. Although certainly because they engage in these strategies, those strategies themselves help to support their resiliency. So that's, I think, is the relationship between the two.
But and then to add what Alicia just explained, like one reason that we looked at how they modify their programs, or if they had to serve fewer people, or they had to cancel their program, suspend the program, is that in the nonprofit literature, there most of the times the organization resiliency is measured by their financial resiliency, whether they have survived or not, or if their financial standing has been in crisis or not. And we wanted to look at different ways, because it's not just about their budgetary impact, but it's more about how their organization had to be resilient to continue to serve. But I was hearing the question gave me an idea that I mean, again, that this is a working paper that I chose, like we chose to present this so that we can get the feedback to continue to modify the way that we analyze. But indeed, we looked at 12 different issues that include like cancellation or events or suspend programs. Although I still think that organization being resilient means they continue to serve rather than just suspend the programs indefinitely or just cancel the event or having their contract entirely canceled. But I also hear that that it can be part of their resiliency strategy that they cancel the programs in order to survive. But that goes back to some discussion of whether the resiliency is just about survival versus resilient to continue to provide services. That I think that requires some thinking on my part, but it just gives me an idea that I think Alicia and I should look at these 12 items rather than in a indiscriminate way, but like we have to think further. Maybe this is a part of the resilience strategy, and then this is really then like the suspending the programs permanently is really that not being resilient. So it gives us some idea in that regard. But then I also just to add, this was a survey done at the end of 2020. So the organizations that were more resilient were able to get back on their feet, whereas the organizations that were really struggle continued to close their doors. So I think the timing of the survey provides some extra explanation why we think it conceptually captured how they're resilient. We also this project also had a COVID survey done April 2020, like right after lockdown or in the middle of the lockdown, but we purposely didn't use that survey response because we believe that that is the time that that there was some difference between the organization not resilient or resilient, but it's just the timing of the survey that didn't fully capture. But we thought the survey that were done at the end of 2020 had a better way to capture whether they were able to get back on their feet.
Okay. My second question, I don't want to take up all the time, so I'll make it very quick. I didn't quite get hypothesis 4. I didn't understand why size of budget would have any causal effect on your definition of resiliency. Very large arts organizations, Metropolitan Museum of Art or Metropolitan Opera, they have so much of their budget committed that they can be a very large organization, very large budget, and yet with the downturn of COVID be in a big amount of trouble because so many of their resources are committed. And a small nonprofit arts organization with a small budget might have a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to adjust to this. So I didn't quite get the rationale or the theory behind hypothesis number 4.
So I think Alicia and I had some discussion about this, so maybe I will ask Alicia to respond to that question.
So, you know, it's interesting because it's sort of essentially a path dependency argument that tells us that organizations that have this capacity in the first place, that they have more wiggle room, right? So let's say if it's a large organization, then yes, they can be hit significantly, but at least they don't have to like consider closure. While if it's a smaller organization and they're unprepared, then they're more likely to die, right? So this was the path dependency sort of argument, that larger organizations are more flexible. But this was also exactly the story that I obtained on the study that I did in Detroit on the post-recession, Great Recession, that basically clearly showed that small organizations are way more vulnerable than large organizations, because small organizations are the ones that actually had to consider closure or close for a while most of the large organizations did not do that. They did have significant cutback, you know, strategies, and they had to downsize programs, but it didn't quite, the effect of stress was not as drastic. So I guess this was the direction that we chose, was based both on the path dependency argument, right, and the resources as a cushion, and also the previous research during the Great Recession that basically clearly indicated that small organizations are most vulnerable to this type of event.
Well, a large organization like the Detroit Institute of the Arts is more eligible for a bailout, you know, essentially. But I'll leave it there. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Kelsey, you've had your hand up for a little while, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Awesome. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you. I was really excited to see the work that you presented. And my question in a way relates to Michael's about strategies that help support resiliency that organizations are learning about as they're, you know, traversing this pandemic stress and challenges. In my day job, I work for a technology company that supports the operational needs of arts and cultural organizations globally. So a lot of the organizations that I'm talking to and working with right now feel more or less very well equipped, or at least more equipped than they previously were, to handle pandemic-related stress and challenges. And they're now turning their attention to future risk and stresses. And, you know, this might be a little bit of a sticky question, but since pandemics don't typically occur that often, I'm interested in your thoughts on applying this to the future. For example, have you thought about how lessons learned or experience becoming resilient / building up resiliency during this pandemic may factor into predictions for future resiliency?
So if I rephrase the question, that do you would this organization that had learned their lessons would help us predict their resiliency in the future?
Yes.
Yeah, we haven't really thought about that, like for the future crisis, but the way that we started this study was actually this study builds off from my co-author Alisa's previous study that she did, a study of art organization in Detroit, that how they had, which organizations were resilient during the last recession, the crisis, and we wanted to build up from that study to see how organizations were resilient during the pandemic. So I agree that the pandemic is not something that occurs often, that some people never experience in their life, and I don't know, it's fortunate or unfortunate that we experience in our lifetime. But yeah, it doesn't happen often, but it's just pandemic is one of the crises that organization gets subject to. And I will ask my co-author Alisa to talk a little bit more about how how the other crises that she used for her previous study have framed the way that we looked at the pandemic impact on these organizations.
And you know, to add to what Mira said, I think like the major takeaway point of this paper is fully consistent with the study that I did in Detroit, and it's this, we have so much evidence of the prevalence of bonding connections or arts organizations tending to connect with those who are similar to them. And in my previous study, I actually looked at arts connecting with other arts versus arts connecting with, education and others. But it's the same finding. It's such a high level of bonding social capital, which is understandable because bonding is based on trust, and organizations with similar cultural norms tend to know and trust each other more. But it really, based on this study and the previous study, tends to hurt organizations if they only rely on, ties with those organizations that experience very similar pressures to them. So they cannot really bounce back as effectively. So looking into the future, the one kind of normative implication of these findings that, Mirae just presented and my previous research is that arts and culture organizations really need to diversify their networks. And there is a variety of factors why it's not happening. I'm sure there are people here in the room that are familiar with, arts organizational culture. And, for instance, the fear that many arts organizations have about mission and how distinct their mission is. And if they have to partner with somebody else, they might divert from their main artistic mission. So that's just one narrative that, more of a qualitative type of approach unpacks. But I believe it's a problem. And of course, there are good reasons why it's harder for arts to partner more with education, partner more with social services, right? But there are also good reasons to believe so far that this is the way to go, meaning that it is the kind of implication that we can recommend and prepare organizations going into the future to make them more resilient. It's just to start by diversifying their connections.
Thank you.
Carol, you've had your hand up and I was going to get to your chat too, because I think you're talking about size, but I think you're almost getting to this sort of selection issue about what types of large organizations already do, which is this idea, which is partnering. So if you want to ask it, Carol.
Thanks, Joanna. So, also incorporating some of what Michael said and some of the comments following up. So my first question was that I was curious to hear more about how the size of organizations influences the results, because maybe these kinds of partnerships are things that larger organizations just tend to do or tend to have the capacities and resources to do, or already established connections from other networks of social capital or cultural capital. But also that maybe this is just the way that larger organizations tend to talk about what they do, that they see themselves as more connected, whereas organizations from other types of organizations might not talk about what they do in that way. And relating that to what you were just talking about, Alisa, I just wonder, particularly as so much of this work goes back, as you said, to your work in Detroit, how much race and ethnic background of staff and mission might also relate to these questions. And I ask this not so much as a matter of methodology, but rather because you're making such direct kind of recommendations about how organizations should behave to foster resiliency, that it may be the case that organizations from some communities should not diversify, or that smaller organizations should not use their resources and capacities to focus on that because there's something in the nature of smaller organizations that it's better for them to be more flexible, for example, as Michael suggested, rather than however they might be if they were larger. Okay, so I'd be interested to hear any reactions you all have to those comments and questions.
So the number and quality of connections are two different things. And in fact, in my previous study, I did find that larger organizations tend to have more connections, right? So the network size is larger. But in terms of the network composition, meaning the diversity of the networks or how well connected organizations are, the organizational size mattered less. So basically, like in a nutshell, not to go into a network methodology right now, but in a nutshell, if small organizations are able to build fewer connections, but in more strategic ways, they can benefit from those connections. And just having more connections does not necessarily make you more resilient, because like you were saying, Carol, you know, they take a lot of capacity from the organizations to build and maintain those connections. So the story here is just as a quality of connection that might matter more, especially when we control for organizational size rather than just the pure number of connections. But you are exactly right. The larger the organization is, the higher capacity they will have to build more connections. And you know, your question about Detroit, another thing that came out in Detroit is the location. And those of you who are familiar with Detroit, I mean, so the data that I did was 2015, 2016. So thankfully, things are changing and organizations are reaching out actively, including with the help of Culture Source. I think I saw Adam on call today. So there is more effort now to bridge the urban-suburban divide. But when I collected these data, I visualized those networks. And you know, what I saw is pretty much the story of Detroit. So you will have pockets of suburban organizations connecting with each other. And you have urban organizations, especially small ones, being completely disconnected. So that kind of, you know, tells you that, you know, there is age that the organization that matters to, size, but also location, and also kind of the local culture. And in the study like that Mirae does, you know, that I'm collaborating with her, and it was kind of impossible to control for all of these factors. But in principle, it's a good question to try to control, at least, you know, for organizational location and what type of organization it is, like urban versus suburban. I think we might see some interesting findings here.
And about the size, I just realized I didn't fully explain during the presentation that and because for the reason that Carol was talking about, that the larger organizations were likely to have larger number of partnerships to begin with, because they have a larger number of programs, that the way they recorded the value of the responses was rather than the type, the number of partnership, but which type, like how many types, different areas, human service programs or financial or marketing and communication. Like there were 5 different areas that we asked the respondents to say how many partners they had for different issues, different areas. So the way it captured was in how many different areas they had partnered with other types of organization, to reduce the impact of the larger organizations reporting larger number of partnerships. And in general, it was interesting that for large organizations, they had really, the average value was below 1 for out of 5 areas that they don't really partner with for-profit and government. And then we did give the definition of partnership that does not include receiving grants from business or government. So excluding those as a partnership, that when we gave the definition that the average number of partnership was very small. And also about Carol's point about the racial, the ethnic demographic, how that influence or interact with the partnership, that I'm chairing a dissertation for a doctoral student at Georgia State University, and she's looking at if the racial ethnicity of the executive director at nonprofit and their board members have anything to do with the extent to which their organization partner with other organization. And she's finishing up her dissertation now. And she found the clear evidence that people of color, like the organization led by people of color, have a much smaller network that they can engage. They are currently engaged, and there is a question of why that they have barriers in reaching out to larger network that allow their organization to have more access to resources and information. By the way, yeah, I noticed that Frederick had a...
Yeah, Frederick, I wanted to call on you. You put it down, but do you still have a question?
Well, I have questions, but but I don't know if I have time. I don't know when you're ending. I don't want to.
We end at 1, so if you have a question, please go ahead. I saw your hand up for a while.
Okay, all right. No, I thank you. I basically sort of 2 questions, comments in a sense. One, I must say I was a little bit confused about this notion of sort of organization versus independent social capital. to me, it seems very difficult and strange. How, I mean, okay, I can understand it conceptually, but how can you ever separate that in any study? And it would, for me, it would also seem like, particular in arts organizations, in particular in small organizations, that those sort of personal connections with board members and so on must be extremely important. So, because, you know, you ask about partnerships, that sounds very formal to me. You know, I mean, and so I'm wondering if there's sort of like an element of social capital that's being missed here, especially for the smaller organizations, that I'd be curious if you could dig into more. My other question is more, and I'm more of a comment. My other is more regarding your sort of your suggestion here that you should have more bridging social capital. But, and you say, okay, maybe do, but I still don't understand why. Why is bridging social capital sort of linked to positive resiliency? Because I think you could argue the opposite, like, you know, don't jump into bed with more businesses, you know, I mean, and stuff like that. That's just mission drift waiting, you know, and I mean, and all these other things. So I'm a little bit curious if you could develop a little bit, what is sort of like the theoretical or the conceptual argument for why sort of more bridging social capital increases nonprofit resiliency.
So, you know, a quick response to your first question. I hate to be like one of these respondents that send people to the work of others, but we are using the work by John Schneider that does a very good job in defining the difference between organizational social capital and, you know, interpersonal social capital. But that sort of serves the basis here. But basically, in a nutshell, the difference is that organizational social capital tends to be cumulative. So next CEO is going to add to the organizational social capital. And if some of the ties are weak and people take those ties with them, then they, you know, just stay as interpersonal ties. But as an example, I served as a board member and I brought in a new connection and then I left, but the connection is still there. So that's basically an example of what organizational social capital. Organizations continue those ties with different people, although people left. So that's kind of the major distinction. And in terms of bonding versus bridging, so we also had this discussion with Mirae, because, you know, I am more familiar with the network literature, but also, you know, with the work of Putnam and others. And there is different evidence in the literature, actually. Some of the evidence support the argument that you, Frederick, are making, right, in terms of the utility of bonding versus bridging. For example, there are studies that show that in stress, bonding social capital tends to be better, because in the stress, you have to have very strong ties to be able to utilize social capital. But there are also studies that show that bridging social capital is more beneficial because it gives access to unique resources, right? So the argument here is transaction costs versus resources. So it can be argued both ways, theoretically speaking, but most of the literature supports the importance of bridging social capital over bonding, at least in the community context, you know, and individual context. So Granovetter, the strengths of weak ties, is another example. You know, it's the bridging social capital. It's people who you don't know as well who are going to get you a job, as compared to people who, you know, you see every day and, you know, you're in the same place. So this is maybe just an oversimplified answer to your question, but I agree with you that there is evidence in the literature and in previous empirical studies that goes both ways. So we just had to make a choice for what made more sense for us, considering the context of arts and culture organizations and the research question that we are asking.
Okay, thank you. Any last kind of comments or words before we have to log off? I don't want to just abruptly stop us. Any last questions? I know there's some great discussion in the chat, so thank you for all of that. Thank you, Mirae, and thank you, Alisa. This was just such a stimulating discussion, and honestly, I love work in progress. This is the reason we really have this workshop, to bring work in progress and to have this discussion. So I appreciate that you did that for us, because I know it can be a little bit jarring sometimes to bring something that you're not 100% confident with, right? But thank you. So everybody, I would give a round of applause, but we're all in our own room. So thanks again, and I hope we can have you back. And please do attend our next workshop in cultural affairs in 2 weeks, which is Michael Seaman from Colorado State University. Great scholar, great guy, and I'm excited to see everyone back in a couple weeks.